What if a president decided the entire field of economics was wrong? That to fight soaring prices, you should do the exact opposite of what every textbook says. Turkey tried it. They lowered interest rates while inflation hit 85%. They spent $60 billion on a scheme guaranteeing depositors against the very collapse the government was causing. And they watched the lira lose 91% of its value. This is the story of how a G20 economy deliberately broke itself, and the trap that made fixing it even more dangerous. But this isn't just a story about a currency collapse. It's about a trap that 85 million people can't escape from, and a warning for every country where political ideology starts overruling economic reality. This is happening right now. The savings of millions of Turkish families have been wiped out, not gradually, but in real time. The minimum wage has fallen below the hunger threshold for the first time in Turkish history. 80 doctors emigrate every single month. 72% of young Turks say they'd leave if they could. Turkey's story matters because it proves something terrifying. A G20 economy can deliberately sabotage itself, watch the damage unfold, and still not be able to stop. If it can happen there, a NATO member, an EU customs union partner, the world's 13th largest auto producer, what's stopping it from happening elsewhere? How safe are your savings when the rules of economics are thrown out the window? And don't worry, we'll break down every trap and scheme in plain English. To understand how Turkey got into this mess, we need to go back to 2018, to a declaration in London that shocked global markets. May 14, 2018. President Erdogan is in London, meeting with money managers, and he makes a declaration that sends shockwaves through financial markets. He intends to take greater control of the economy, including de facto control over monetary policy. Investors responded with, and I'm quoting here, shock and disbelief. Within weeks, a presidential decree gave Erdogan power to appoint the central bank governor, deputies, and the entire Monetary Policy Committee. Central bank independence, the cornerstone of modern monetary policy, the thing that separates functional economies from banana republics, was over. Just like that. Now, the intellectual justification was deceptively simple. High interest rates cause inflation through higher business costs, so lower rates mean lower inflation. If that sounds backwards to you, you're right. Every economics textbook says the opposite. But here's what Erdogan was actually thinking. Interest rates are the mother and father of all evil, he declared. He called himself an enemy of interest rates, and rate hikes treason. But there was something deeper. In December 2021, as the lira crashed to record lows, Erdogan stated explicitly, "As a Muslim, I will continue doing what our religion tells us. This is the command." His views on riba, that's riba, the Islamic prohibition on usury, trace back to his mentorship under Islamist politician Necmettin Erbakan in the 1990s. This wasn't just bad economics. It was ideology dressed up as policy. So what happened when central bankers tried to follow Orthodox economics? They were fired. Murat Çetinkaya, April 2016 to July 2019. Fired via presidential decree for refusing to cut rates from 24%. Murat Uysal, July 2019 to November 2020. Fired after the lira lost 30%. Then came Naji Agbal, November 2020 to March 2021. He raised rates 875 basis points in just 4.5 months. The lira rebounded 15% under his watch. Markets loved him. He was fired 2 days after his final rate hike, at 2 a.m. on a Saturday. By Monday morning, the lira had crashed 15%. His replacement? Shahap Kavcioglu, an AKP parliamentarian with zero central banking experience. He slashed rates from 19% to 8.5%. The pattern was unmistakable. Any governor who raised rates would be dismissed within days. Remember that, because we're about to see what happens when there's no one left willing to say no. The lira went into freefall. But here's what most people don't realize. For some, this wasn't a bug. It was a feature. The collapsing lira made Turkish exports incredibly cheap. Tourism hit record highs, $61 billion in 2024, over 52 million foreign visitors. Medical tourism alone generated $3 billion. The government called it a success. But this boom was built on the backs of Turkish workers. Their wages, savings, and purchasing power were being systematically destroyed, transferred to tourists and exporters paying in dollars while earning in lira. Quick question for the comments. If you were an average Turkish worker watching foreign tourists enjoy cheap vacations while your savings evaporated, would you call that a success? Or would you call it theft in slow motion? Let me know below. But that $61 billion in tourism revenue? It would be dwarfed by what the government was about to lose on a single desperate gamble. And as the lira continued its descent, the real-world consequences for ordinary Turks escalated in terrifying ways. The official inflation rate was bad enough, peaking at 85% in October 2022. But here's where it gets interesting. The independent ENAG research group, that's ENAG, which tracks actual prices rather than government baskets, estimated real inflation at 185%, more than double the official figure. As of December 2025, official inflation sits at 31%. ENAG estimates 60 to 70%. Now, the gap isn't academic. A former head of TÜİK, that's Turkey's Statistical Institute, pronounced TÜİK, has publicly stated that the agency underreports inflation. A lawsuit filed in September 2024 alleges deliberate manipulation. So when the government tells you inflation is under control, ask yourself, whose numbers are they using? Here's where the math gets brutal. With policy rates at 9% and inflation at 84%, Turkey experienced real interest rates of negative 75% in November 2022, among the most deeply negative in modern emerging market history. Imagine putting $100 in a savings account and watching it become worth $25 by year's end. That was Turkey. If you held lira in a savings account, you lost 3/4 of your purchasing power in a single year. Let that sink in. Turkish workers lost 1.3 trillion lira, about $39 billion, in wages during the first 9 months of 2025 alone, to inflation and taxes. Real wages eroded 41%. The minimum wage fell below the hunger threshold for the first time in history, and 58% of Turkish workers earn at or near minimum wage. As the DISC-R Research Center put it in October 2025, inflation has turned into a suction pump that drains the poor and feeds the rich. Rent inflation hit 157% year over year in Istanbul. Monthly rents now exceed the minimum wage. Do the math. If your entire paycheck can't cover rent, what exactly are you supposed to eat? But it wasn't just their wages being destroyed. It was their trust in the very concept of money. Trust in the lira evaporated. At the experiment's peak, 70% of bank deposits were either in foreign currency or protect it against depreciation. Turkish households now hold an estimated 3,100 tons of gold worth $387 billion under the mattress, the largest household gold hoard in the world. Total gold holdings in the Turkish economy reached 4,200 tons, valued at $526 billion by August 2025. At the Grand Bazaar, gold merchants report 90% of customers buying, almost none selling. Customers arrive with suitcases full of cash. By the way, this gold hoard is so large that if Turkish households decided to sell all at once, they could briefly crash the global gold market. That's how much trust they've lost in their own currency. Perhaps the most consequential damage: human capital flight. EU blue cards issued to skilled Turks nearly quadrupled in 5 years, from around 1,500 in 2018 to nearly 6,000 by 2023. Doctors emigrating? 80 per month, over a 2,000% increase since 2012. At one Istanbul hospital, 149 out of 150 intern doctors were studying for licensing exams in the US or Germany, not Turkey. Why? 86% of doctors report physical or verbal assault from patients, wages approaching minimum wage levels, and 72% of Turks aged 18 to 25 want to emigrate. Top destinations: United States, Germany, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Canada. Turkey isn't just losing money, it's losing its future. An entire generation of doctors, engineers, and IT professionals gone. And unlike currency, you can't print more skilled workers. By 2023, a new team came in and started fixing things. Inflation was dropping, reserves were rebuilding. And then, Erdogan did something that proved, once and for all, that economics would always come second to politics. June 2023. Erdogan, freshly re-elected, makes a stunning reversal. He appoints Mehmet Şimşek, a former Merrill Lynch economist, as finance minister. Hafize Gaye Erkan, a Princeton PhD, former Goldman Sachs managing director, as central bank governor. Rates soar from 8.5% all the way to 50%. Over 4,000 basis points of hikes. It looked like sanity had returned. Markets breathed a sigh of relief. Analysts started upgrading Turkey. All 3 rating agencies, Fitch, Moody's, S&P, upgraded the country in 2024. The only country to get upgrades from all 3 that year? Then came March 2025. Istanbul's popular mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, Erdogan's main political rival, was arrested on March 19th. The lira crashed 12% in 3 days, briefly hitting a record low above 40 to the dollar. The central bank burned through $25 billion in just 3 days defending the currency. An emergency 200 basis point rate hike followed the very next day. One political arrest undid months of careful economic management. In Turkey, politics doesn't just influence economics, it annihilates it. This is where we find the heart of the problem. Turkey isn't just suffering a crisis, it's caught in a trap, one that makes escaping nearly as dangerous as staying. Remember those governors who got fired for raising rates? There was a reason Erdogan kept them low beyond ideology. The experiment created a situation where reversing policy became nearly as dangerous as continuing it. This explains why the policy persisted for 5 years despite obvious failure. Turkey is trapped. And here's why. Turkish corporations hold approximately $214 billion in net foreign currency debt, mostly unhedged. Sharp rate hikes that strengthen the lira could theoretically bankrupt companies that borrowed in dollars, expecting continued depreciation. Banks hold $50 billion in FX loans to energy companies alone. At least $10 billion is troubled in the real estate sector. Total external debt? Nearly $565 billion, with almost two-thirds of it in foreign currency. Look at those numbers. Over $500 billion in external debt, nearly two-thirds of it in foreign currency. If the lira strengthens too fast, corporate Turkey goes bankrupt. If it weakens, citizens get crushed. There's no good option, only less bad ones. Now we get to that $60 billion scheme I mentioned at the start. When the lira crashed to 18 per dollar in December 2021, Erdogan refused to raise rates, but needed to prevent complete collapse. The solution? The KKM, a scheme guaranteeing lira depositors against currency depreciation. Here's how it worked. If the lira fell more than the interest you earned, the Treasury would pay the difference. Sounds reasonable, right? Keep your money in lira, we'll protect you from losses. At its peak, the KKM attracted $140 billion, more than a quarter of all bank deposits. When the dollar stood at 13 lira, this seemed manageable. As the lira fell toward 40, the Treasury's liability exploded. Total cost? Approximately $60 billion, one of the most expensive regulatory measures in Turkey's recent economic history. For context, this equals earthquake relief spending, or 87% of annual pensions for over 16 million retirees. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. Unwinding the KKM required convincing depositors lira savings were safe, which required credible monetary policy, which required raising rates, which Erdogan refused. Only after his May 2023 re-election did Orthodox policy return, enabling phase-out. The KKM was finally terminated August 23, 2025, with balances reduced to $11 billion. $60 billion later, the Central Bank of Turkey borrowed approximately $90 billion from domestic banks, plus $40 billion through swaps. Net foreign exchange reserves went deeply negative. Think of it like this. If you owe your neighbor $60 billion, but your wallet shows zero, technically you have $0, but practically, you're $60 billion in the hole. That's the difference between Turkey's reserves including swaps and excluding swaps. Net reserves including swaps fell to negative $200 million in May 2023, first negative in 21 years. Net reserves excluding swaps, negative $60 billion. The record low hit negative $65.5 billion in March 2024. Goldman Sachs estimated the central bank sold approximately $140 billion in currency interventions between 2019 and 2021. The Central Bank of Turkey was functionally bankrupt in dollar terms. The institution supposed to defend the currency had nothing left to defend it with. Turkey's experiment wasn't unprecedented, but its deliberate nature was. Argentina? Recurring crises, political interference, currency collapses. But Argentina's decline was from historical wealth. Venezuela? Brain drain, loss of trust in currency. But Venezuela's was oil-triggered. Turkey's was a policy choice. Zimbabwe? Peak inflation of 79 billion% monthly, Far more extreme, but again, different circumstances. What saved Turkey from Venezuelan outcomes? Diversified manufacturing. They're the 13th largest auto producer. NATO membership. EU Customs Union access. Tourism, generating 12% of GDP. And lower government debt, 35 to 40% versus Argentina's 85%. Turkey had structural advantages, and it nearly threw them all away, on purpose. So what happens when the government can no longer pretend to be in control? When the trap finally snaps shut? The climax isn't a single event. It's a dawning realization. The government has lost all credibility. March 2025 was the proof. Erdogan arrested his main political rival on March 19th. The market response was immediate and devastating. A 12% currency crash in 3 days, briefly breaching 40 to the dollar. The central bank burned through $25 billion in just 3 days, $50 billion total, defending the Lira. An emergency overnight rate hike followed the very next day. Massive protests erupted in Istanbul, Ankara, and across Turkey. A viral moment. Police chasing a protester in a Pikachu costume. You can't make this stuff up. The government banned short selling and relaxed buyback rules trying to stabilize markets. The episode proved something critical. Even with the right people in charge of economics, Şimşek, Karahan, Orthodox policy, the political system itself is the source of instability. Politics will always trump economics when Erdogan decides it must. The mystery we started with, why a country would knowingly pursue failing policy, is answered here. It was never just about economics. It was about maintaining a specific model of political power, one that prioritized short-term growth and political loyalty over long-term stability, even at the cost of the nation's future. As Steve Hanke of the Cato Institute put it, the Turkish economy suffers from periodic crises and volatility. Why? These problems are the result of a vulnerable, unstable lira and a mismanaged national balance sheet. The true cost isn't just money. It's trust. When a population gives up on its own currency, on its government's ability to manage the economy, the social contract breaks down. 70% of deposits fled to dollars or gold. 72% of young people want to leave. Turkey didn't just have an economic crisis. It had a crisis of faith. And those don't heal with rate hikes. Turkey is at a crossroads. The experiment failed. Orthodox policy returned. But is it really over? Current policy rates stand at 38% as of the end of 2025. After the March 2025 crisis forced an emergency hike to 46%, the central bank resumed cutting once stability returned. Real rates are finally positive, approximately 6 to 7%. The Orthodox policy appears entrenched. The KKM scheme was terminated. All 3 rating agencies upgraded Turkey in 2024, the only country to receive upgrades from Fitch, Moody's, and S&P that year. But one critical risk remains. Political interference is always possible. So where does Turkey go from here? 3 scenarios. Scenario A, the slow grind. This is most likely. Gradual disinflation, years of economic hardship. The government continues its balancing act, orthodox enough for markets, political enough for survival. As Vice President Yilmaz stated, could inflation be reduced faster? Yes, if you sacrifice growth, employment, and social balance. Scenario B, the hard reset. Possible but unlikely while Erdogan remains. Political change brings truly independent institutions, deep structural reforms. A short, sharp recession purges imbalances. Scenario C. Status quo returns. Also possible. Reversion to unorthodox policies whenever politically convenient. Recurring crises. Permanent instability. As analyst Timothy Ash noted, never say never. Who won in all this? Exporters, tourism operators, foreign real estate buyers, politically connected elites. Who lost? The middle class, the youth, doctors, engineers, anyone with savings in Lira. In any scenario, the Turkish people have already lost a decade of progress. A generation of educated young people has fled or wants to. The institutional damage to central bank credibility, to statistical integrity, will take years to repair. Turkey's story is a powerful lesson. There are no shortcuts in economics. The independence of institutions isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. When ideology overrides arithmetic, when political survival trumps sound policy, the bill always comes due. The only question is, who pays it? In Turkey, it wasn't the politicians, it was the people. The next test comes in 2028, Turkey's next presidential election. Will they stay the course, or will politics override economics once again? If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you're subscribed. And if you haven't seen our deep dive into Russia's sanction paradox, how political decisions backfired on the West, check it out. Links on screen. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Turkey stick with Orthodox policy through 2028, or does Erdogan revert when it's politically convenient? The question isn't whether the Turkish economy recovers. It's whether the people who broke it will ever let it heal.